Mockery met her badge. Then, the colonel spoke of the 4 legends who earned it. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood at attention outside Colonel Morrison's office, her newly minted badge gleaming on her dress uniform. The hallway buzzed with whispered conversations and barely concealed smirks from passing officers. She had heard the comments all morning, each one cutting deeper than the last. "Another desk jockey with shiny metal," muttered Captain Rodriguez as he walked past, not bothering to lower his voice. "Probably never seen real action in her life." Sarah kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, though her jaw tightened imperceptibly. The Distinguished Service Cross on her chest felt heavier with each passing comment. She had earned it during a classified operation in Eastern Europe, but the details remained locked away in government files. To her fellow officers, she was just another politician's daughter who had somehow talked her way into a medal. The door to Colonel Morrison's office opened with a sharp click. "Lieutenant Chen, please enter," came the gruff voice from within. Sarah stepped into the spacious office, noting the wall lined with commendations, photos of military operations, and a large American flag hanging behind an imposing oak desk. Colonel Morrison, a man in his late 50s with graying temples and piercing blue eyes, gestured toward a chair opposite his desk. "Sit down, Lieutenant," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years in the military. "I imagine you've had quite a morning." "Sir, yes sir," Sarah replied, maintaining perfect posture even while seated. Colonel Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that revealed nothing. "You know, Lieutenant, I've been watching the reactions around base today. Interesting how quickly rumors spread in a place like this." Sarah remained silent, unsure where the conversation was heading. "Tell me," the colonel continued, "what do you think when you hear those whispers? When you see those looks?" "Sir, I believe actions speak louder than words. My record will stand for itself in time." A slight smile tugged at the corner of Morrison's mouth. "Good answer. But I suspect you're wondering why a 26-year-old lieutenant is wearing the same medal that hangs on the chests of generals and war heroes." "The thought has crossed my mind, sir." Colonel Morrison stood and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds. Soldiers moved in formation below, their synchronized steps creating a rhythmic pattern on the asphalt. "You see, Lieutenant, that badge you're wearing has a very special history. Not many people know the stories behind it, the real stories of how it was earned." He turned back to face her, his expression serious. "I'm going to tell you about 4 legends, for individuals who earned that very same distinction under circumstances that would break most people. Their stories might help you understand why you're facing such skepticism, and, more importantly, why you shouldn't let it affect you." Sarah leaned forward slightly, intrigued despite herself. "The first legend I want to tell you about was a woman named Captain Maria Vasquez. This was back in 1983, during the invasion of Grenada. Maria was a helicopter pilot, one of only a handful of women flying combat missions at the time." Colonel Morrison returned to his seat, his eyes taking on a distant look as he recalled the story. Maria flew a UH-60 Black Hawk, primarily used for medical evacuations and troop transport. She was good at her job, damn good, but she faced the same skepticism you're experiencing now. The men in her unit called her Taxi Maria behind her back, suggesting she was only good for ferry runs and easy missions. On October 25, the second day of Operation Urgent Fury, Maria received orders to extract a wounded reconnaissance team from Point Salines Airport. Intelligence reports indicated heavy enemy resistance in the area, but the wounded needed immediate medical attention. The colonel paused, reaching for a glass of water on his desk. What intelligence didn't tell her was that a Cuban construction battalion had set up a sophisticated anti-aircraft position near the landing zone. As Maria approached the extraction point, her Black Hawk came under intense fire. Sarah found herself drawn into the story, imagining the chaos of that moment. The first RPG took out her tail rotor. Most pilots would have crashed immediately, but Maria managed to auto-rotate the aircraft down to a somewhat controlled landing about 200 meters from the wounded team's position. Her co-pilot was unconscious from the impact, and her crew chief had taken shrapnel in his leg. Morrison's voice grew more intense as he continued. "Maria could have stayed with the downed aircraft and waited for backup. That would have been the safe, by-the-book decision. Instead, she grabbed her M16 and a medical kit, and she ran those 200 meters under heavy fire to reach the reconnaissance team. What she found there was worse than expected. 5 Rangers, 3 of them critically wounded, pinned down by enemy fire from multiple positions. The team leader had lost consciousness from blood loss, and the remaining men were running low on ammunition. Sarah could picture the scene in her mind, the desperation of the wounded soldiers and the impossible decision facing Captain Vasquez. Maria assessed the situation in seconds. She applied pressure bandages to the most critical wounds while calling in her position to command. But here's where the legend really begins, Lieutenant. When she learned that backup wouldn't arrive for at least 30 minutes, Maria made a decision that defied all conventional military wisdom. The colonel leaned forward, his eyes intense. She decided to single-handedly assault the enemy positions to create an escape route for her wounded comrades. "Sir, that seems..." Sarah began, then stopped herself. "Impossible? Suicidal?" That's what the after-action reports called it initially. But Maria had studied the terrain during her approach, and she had noticed something the enemy hadn't considered. There was a drainage ditch that ran along the eastern edge of their position, masked by overgrown vegetation. Morrison stood again, using his hands to illustrate the tactical situation. Maria used smoke grenades from the Rangers' equipment to create a diversion to the west, then crawled through that drainage ditch to flank the primary enemy position. It was a 100-meter crawl through mud and stagnant water, with enemy fire passing overhead. When she reached the optimal position, Maria had a clear line of sight on the Cuban machine gun nest that was keeping her people pinned down. "Single shots, Lieutenant." She couldn't afford to give away her position with automatic fire. 3 quick, precise shots, and the machine gun fell silent. Sarah was completely absorbed in the story now, her own troubles momentarily forgotten. But taking out one position wasn't enough. There were still 2 more enemy positions maintaining fire on the Rangers. Maria had to move again, this time using the confusion she had created to bound between cover points. She eliminated the second position with a hand grenade, perfectly cooked and thrown. The colonel's voice dropped to almost a whisper. The third position was the most dangerous. It was elevated, giving the enemy soldiers a commanding view of the entire area. Maria couldn't flank it, couldn't approach it without being seen. So she did something that still amazes me today. She used herself as bait. Sarah's eyes widened. "Sir?" Maria deliberately exposed herself to draw the enemy's fire, then used their muzzle flashes to zero in on their exact position. She took a bullet in her shoulder during this maneuver, but she got the location data she needed. One well-placed 40mm grenade from an M203 launcher she had taken from one of the wounded Rangers, and the third position was eliminated. Morrison returned to his seat, his expression one of deep respect. With the immediate threat neutralized, Maria helped the mobile Rangers move their wounded comrades to a more defensible position. She set up a proper perimeter, administered first aid to the most critical patients, and coordinated with incoming air support. When the rescue helicopters finally arrived, they found Captain Maria Vasquez covered in mud and blood, her uniform torn, but standing guard over 5 Rangers who owed their lives to her actions. Not one of those men died that day. The office fell silent for a moment as Sarah processed the incredible story. "What happened to Captain Vasquez after that, sir?" She was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions that day. But, more importantly, she never heard another word about being just a taxi pilot. Her call sign became Guardian Angel, and it stuck for the rest of her career. Colonel Morrison fixed Sarah with a steady gaze. "Maria faced the same skepticism you're facing now, Lieutenant." People questioned whether she belonged, whether she had earned her place. But, when the moment came, when lives were on the line, she proved that courage and competence have nothing to do with what people expect and everything to do with what you're willing to sacrifice for others. Sarah felt a strange mixture of inspiration and intimidation. "Sir, how do you know so many details about the operation?" "Because I was the squad leader of that reconnaissance team, Lieutenant. Captain Maria Vasquez saved my life that day, along with 4 of my men. I was the one who recommended her for the Distinguished Service Cross." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She was sitting across from one of the men whose life had been saved by the legendary pilot. "I've carried that story with me for 40 years, Lieutenant. I've told it to every young officer who's faced doubt about their place in this military. Because the truth is, we all face the doubt at some point. The question isn't whether people will question you, the question is how you'll respond when the moment comes to prove yourself." Colonel Morrison glanced at his watch. "We still have time for another story before your next appointment. The second legend I want to tell you about was a man named Sergeant First Class David Kim. This was during the Gulf War in 1991. Sarah settled back in her chair, eager to hear another tale of extraordinary courage. David was a combat engineer, specializing in explosive ordnance disposal. Like you, he was young for his rank and responsibilities. Unlike you, he came from a family with no military background whatsoever. His parents owned a small grocery store in Los Angeles, and they couldn't understand why their academically gifted son had chosen military service over college. The colonel's voice took on a different tone as he spoke about Sergeant Kim. David was brilliant, absolutely brilliant when it came to understanding explosives and defensive systems. But he was also quiet, unassuming, the kind of person who gets overlooked in a crowd. His fellow soldiers respected his technical expertise, but they questioned whether he had the nerves for combat situations. During the ground offensive phase of Operation Desert Storm, David's unit was attached to the 1st Armored Division as they advanced toward Kuwait City. Their mission was to clear paths through Iraqi defensive positions, particularly areas that had been heavily mined. Morrison pulled out a map from his desk drawer, spreading it across the surface. Though it was too small for Sarah to see details from her position, she could tell it showed tactical positions and movement routes. On February 26, 1991, David's team was tasked with clearing a section of Highway 80, which had become a critical supply route for advancing coalition forces. Intelligence indicated moderate resistance and standard Soviet-era mining patterns. What they found instead was one of the most sophisticated defensive positions our forces encountered during the entire war. The Iraqis had spent months preparing this position, creating multiple layers of anti-personnel and anti-vehicle mines, backed up by hidden firing positions and booby traps. Sarah could sense another incredible story developing. David's team leader, Staff Sergeant Williams, was taken out by sniper fire within the first hour of the operation. The assistant team leader was wounded by an improvised explosive device that had been cleverly concealed. Suddenly, this quiet, bookish sergeant found himself in command of an 8-man EOD team with a mission that had become exponentially more dangerous. The colonel traced lines on the map as he spoke. The tactical situation was this: David's team was pinned down in a minefield, with enemy snipers covering the area from concealed positions. Coalition forces needed that highway cleared within 6 hours to maintain the operational timeline. Bypassing the area would have meant a significant delay and potential complications for the entire offensive. David made a decision that his training manual probably never covered. Instead of waiting for backup or calling for artillery support that might have damaged the road infrastructure, he decided to systematically dismantle the entire defensive position himself. Sarah found herself holding her breath. Alone, sir? Not entirely alone. He had his team with him, but the technical knowledge and decision-making responsibility fell squarely on his shoulders. David spent 4 hours methodically working his way through that minefield, disarming devices while under intermittent sniper fire. Morrison's voice grew more animated as he continued. But here's what made David's actions legendary. He didn't just clear a path, he identified the pattern in the enemy's defensive layout. He realized that the Iraqis had created what he called a cascade system where disarming mines in the wrong order would trigger secondary explosions. David mapped the entire system in his head, identifying the key devices that were supporting all the others. Instead of clearing mines one by one, which would have taken days, he identified 7 critical devices. By disarming those 7 in the correct sequence, he could safely collapse the entire defensive network. The colonel paused, letting the technical complexity of the situation sink in. Remember, Lieutenant, David was doing this while taking occasional sniper fire. He had to time his movements, use cover effectively, and maintain absolute precision with his technical work. One mistake, one wrong wire cut, and he would have triggered an explosion that could have killed his entire team. Sarah was completely absorbed in the story. How did he deal with the snipers? That's where David's quiet intelligence really showed. He couldn't see the sniper positions directly, but he could analyze the ballistics of each shot. By studying the angle and timing of the incoming fire, David determined that there were 3 primary firing positions. Morrison smiled slightly. David used the enemy's own defensive system against them. He identified mines that he could detonate remotely, creating diversionary explosions that forced the snipers to shift positions. Each time they moved, David gained more information about their locations. After mapping both the minefield and the sniper positions, David coordinated with his team to create a synchronized operation. While his team provided covering fire against the known sniper positions, David made his final approach to the 7 critical devices. The colonel's voice dropped to emphasize the tension of the moment. David had to disarm those 7 devices in exact sequence, with no margin for error, while his team engaged enemy snipers. The entire operation had to be completed in less than 20 minutes to maintain the element of surprise. One by one, David neutralized those critical devices. First device, a pressure-activated anti-tank mine connected to a network of smaller charges. Second device, a command-detonated system that controlled an entire sector of the defensive position. Third device. Morrison continued describing each technical challenge, and Sarah found herself marveling at the combination of courage and expertise required for such an operation. When David triggered the controlled collapse of the defensive system, the effect was immediate and dramatic. 7 precisely timed explosions eliminated the entire minefield while leaving the road infrastructure intact. The sniper positions, which had been connected to the mine network for communication and early warning, were also neutralized. The colonel rolled up the map and returned it to his drawer. David cleared that highway section in 4 hours and 23 minutes. The original estimate had been 2 days minimum. His actions allowed coalition forces to maintain their operational schedule and contributed significantly to the rapid conclusion of the ground war. Sarah shook her head in amazement. What happened to Sergeant Kim after that? He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that day. But, more importantly, he went on to become one of the most respected EOD specialists in the Army. David eventually earned his commission and retired as a lieutenant colonel. He spent the latter part of his career developing new training protocols for explosive ordnance disposal. Morrison fixed Sarah with another steady gaze. David Kim faced doubt about his capabilities, just like you. People saw a quiet, intellectual young man and wondered if he belonged in a combat environment. But, when the moment came, when lives were on the line and the mission was in jeopardy, David proved that true courage often comes in unexpected packages. The colonel glanced at his watch again. We have time for one more story before you need to report to your next assignment. The third legend I want to tell you about was a Navy SEAL named Petty Officer First Class Rachel Torres. This story takes place during Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. Sarah settled in for another tale, her mind still processing the incredible stories of Captain Vasquez and Sergeant Kim. Rachel was part of SEAL Team 3, operating in the urban environment around Baghdad. She was one of the first women to complete the full SEAL training pipeline, which, as you might imagine, generated considerable controversy and skepticism within the special operations community. The colonel's voice took on a tone of deep respect. Rachel was small in stature, maybe 5'4" and 130 pounds, but she had passed every test, met every standard, and earned her place on the team through pure determination and skill. Still, there were those who questioned whether a woman could handle the physical and psychological demands of direct action missions. On April 7, 2003, Rachel's team received intelligence about a high-value target operating from a compound in eastern Baghdad. The target was a former Republican Guard colonel who was coordinating insurgent attacks against coalition forces. The mission was a night raid to capture or eliminate this individual. Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious. The intelligence was wrong. Instead of finding a small group of insurgents, Rachel's team walked into a trap. The compound was actually a staging area for a much larger enemy force, and they had been expecting coalition special operations teams. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she anticipated another story of incredible courage under impossible circumstances. Rachel's team consisted of 8 SEALs, divided into 2 four-man elements. Alpha element, including Rachel, was responsible for the main compound. Bravo element was tasked with securing the perimeter and preventing enemy escape. The colonel stood and moved to a tactical map on his wall, pointing to various positions as he spoke. When Alpha element breached the main building, they immediately came under heavy fire from prepared positions. The enemy had converted the interior into a maze of reinforced firing positions with interlocking fields of fire. Within minutes, 2 members of Alpha element were down with serious wounds. The team leader had taken a round through his shoulder, and their communications specialist was unconscious from a concussion grenade. Rachel found herself as the senior uninjured member of the element, effectively in command of a deteriorating tactical situation. Morrison traced movement patterns on the map. Bravo element was also in trouble. They had encountered a much larger enemy force than expected and were heavily engaged. Rachel could hear the intensity of their firefight over the radio, but she couldn't expect immediate support. So Rachel was facing a classic special operations nightmare: wounded teammates, superior enemy forces, no immediate backup, and a mission that had gone completely sideways. Most people would have called for immediate extraction and tried to evacuate their wounded. Sarah was beginning to see a pattern in these stories. But she didn't, did she, sir? No, she didn't. Rachel made a tactical assessment that impressed even the most experienced operators in the special operations community. She realized that extracting under fire would likely result in additional casualties, and that the enemy force was too well positioned to simply suppress with small arms fire. The colonel returned to his seat, his eyes intense. Rachel decided to use the enemy's confidence against them. She began withdrawing her element in a controlled manner, making it appear that the SEALs were retreating under pressure. The enemy forces, sensing victory, began advancing from their prepared positions to pursue. What they didn't know was that Rachel had identified the structural weak points in the building during the initial breach. As the enemy forces moved forward, Rachel used explosive charges to collapse key support beams, trapping the majority of the enemy force in the lower level of the building. Sarah's eyes widened. She brought down the building? Partially, yes. Rachel executed a controlled demolition that collapsed specific sections while leaving escape routes for her own team. It was an incredibly complex operation that required precise knowledge of explosives, structural engineering, and timing. Morrison's voice grew more animated. But that was only the beginning. With the main enemy force trapped, Rachel still had to deal with the external security elements and coordinate with Bravo element for extraction. She positioned her remaining team members to provide covering fire, then single-handedly assaulted the enemy positions that were engaging Bravo element. Rachel used night vision and suppressed weapons to eliminate 3 enemy positions without revealing her own location. She then coordinated a complex extraction plan that got all 8 team members out alive, including the 2 wounded operators. The colonel paused, letting the magnitude of Rachel's actions sink in. The after-action report described Rachel's performance as tactically brilliant and operationally flawless. She had turned a failed mission into a tactical victory while ensuring that none of her teammates were left behind. Sarah found herself deeply moved by the story. What happened to Petty Officer Torres after that? She was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and went on to become one of the most decorated female special operations soldiers in military history. Rachel eventually transferred to Delta Force, where she served as a team leader and training instructor. Morrison fixed Sarah with another meaningful look. Rachel Torres faced the ultimate skepticism, Lieutenant. People didn't just question her competence, they questioned her right to be there at all. But, when everything went wrong, when her teammates' lives depended on her decisions, Rachel proved that courage and tactical brilliance have nothing to do with physical size or gender. The colonel checked his watch one final time. I have one more story to share with you, but that will have to wait for another time. You're due at the training facility in 10 minutes. Sarah stood, feeling overwhelmed by the incredible stories she had heard. Sir, thank you for sharing these stories with me. There, inspiring doesn't seem like a strong enough word. Lieutenant, I want you to remember something as you continue your career. Those 3 individuals I told you about today all faced the same skepticism you're experiencing. They all wore the same medal you're wearing. And they all proved that true courage comes from within, not from the approval of others. Morrison stood and extended his hand. Your actions in Eastern Europe earned you that medal, regardless of what anyone else thinks. The details may be classified, but I've read your file. You belong here, Lieutenant. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. As Sarah shook the colonel's hand, she felt a renewed sense of confidence. The weight of the Distinguished Service Cross on her chest no longer felt like a burden, it felt like a connection to a legacy of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. Sir, you mentioned a 4th legend. When will I hear that story? Colonel Morrison smiled. Come back next week, Lieutenant. The 4th story is, well, let's just say it's the most remarkable of all. As Sarah left the colonel's office and walked down the hallway, she noticed that the whispers and stares continued. But now they felt different somehow. She was no longer just Lieutenant Chan with an unexplained medal. She was part of a tradition, connected to legends like Captain Vasquez, Sergeant Kim, and Petty Officer Torres. The badge on her chest caught the light as she walked, and Sarah found herself standing a little taller. She had 3 more incredible stories to think about, and 1 more still to come. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she now knew that she was part of something larger than herself, part of a legacy built on courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to prove oneself when it mattered most. The training facility awaited, and, with it, new opportunities to demonstrate that her Distinguished Service Cross had been earned through actions, not words. The legends Colonel Morrison had shared would stay with her, reminding her that true heroes are often forged in the moments when everyone else expects them to fail. #Mockery met her badge. Document 2 the following week arrived with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty for Lieutenant Sarah Chen. The stories Colonel Morrison had shared about Captain Vasquez, Sergeant Kim, and Petty Officer Torres had become a constant source of strength as she navigated the ongoing skepticism from her fellow officers. The whispers hadn't stopped, but they no longer cut as deeply. Sarah knocked on Colonel Morrison's office door at precisely 1400 hours, just as they had arranged. The familiar voice called for her to enter, and she found the colonel seated behind his desk, reviewing what appeared to be classified documents. Punctual as always, Lieutenant, Morrison said, gesturing toward the same chair she had occupied the previous week. I trust you've had time to reflect on our last conversation. Yes, sir. Those stories have been enlightening. I find myself thinking about Captain Vasquez's tactical decision-making, Sergeant Kim's technical expertise under pressure, and Petty Officer Torres's ability to adapt when everything went wrong. Colonel Morrison nodded approvingly. Good. Understanding how these legends approached their challenges will serve you well. Today, I want to tell you about the 4th legend, and this story is perhaps the most extraordinary of all. He leaned back in his chair, his expression growing distant. The 4th legend was a young officer named 2nd Lieutenant James McKinley. This story takes place during the Vietnam War in 1968, specifically during the Tet Offensive. Sarah settled into her chair, prepared for another tale of remarkable courage. James was a platoon leader with the 1st Cavalry Division, serving in the area around Saigon. He was 23 years old, fresh out of officer candidate school, and, like you, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that some interpreted as arrogance. Morrison pulled out a different map, this one showing the area around Saigon during the Vietnam War. James came from a military family. His father had served in World War II, his grandfather in World War I. There was tremendous pressure on him to live up to the family legacy, but there was also resentment from some of his men who thought he had received his commission based on family connections rather than merit. The colonel pointed to specific locations on the map as he continued. On January 31, 1968, during the opening hours of the Tet Offensive, James's platoon was stationed at Fire Base Charlie, a small outpost about 15 kilometers north of Saigon. Intelligence had indicated possible enemy activity in the area, but nothing suggested the massive coordinated assault that was about to unfold. Sarah could sense the build-up to another incredible story of courage under fire. At approximately 0300 hours, Fire Base Charlie came under attack from what appeared to be a full battalion of North Vietnamese Army regulars, supported by Viet Cong sappers who had infiltrated the perimeter during the night. Morrison's voice took on the intensity that Sarah had come to associate with his most gripping stories. James's platoon consisted of 32 men, defending a position that had been designed to handle harassment attacks from small enemy units. They were facing odds of nearly 10 to 1, with limited ammunition, no immediate backup, and communication systems that had been compromised by enemy sappers. Within the first hour of the attack, Fire Base Charlie lost its commanding officer, its executive officer, and 2 of its 3 platoon leaders. James suddenly found himself as the senior officer responsible for the defense of the entire base. Sarah felt the familiar tension building as she imagined the impossible situation facing the young lieutenant. The tactical situation was hopeless by any conventional measure. Enemy forces had breached the perimeter in 3 locations, the ammunition supply was rapidly dwindling, and several key defensive positions had been overrun. Standard military doctrine would have called for immediate withdrawal to a secondary defensive line. Colonel Morrison stood and moved to the window, his gaze distant as he recalled the events. But James made a decision that defied conventional wisdom. Instead of withdrawing, he chose to launch a counterattack against the largest enemy penetration. "Sir, with what forces?" Sarah asked, incredulous. "That's exactly what makes this story so remarkable, Lieutenant." James took personal command of 12 men, the only soldiers still combat effective in his immediate area. He left the remaining defenders to hold the core of the fire base while he led what could only be described as a suicide mission against superior enemy forces. Morrison returned to his seat, his expression intense. James had studied the enemy's attack pattern during the first hour of the assault. He realized that the North Vietnamese forces were following a classic envelopment strategy, trying to surround the fire base before crushing it from all sides. But this strategy had a weakness. The colonel traced movements on the map. The enemy forces advancing from the north were the largest and most dangerous, but they were also the most exposed. If James could eliminate this threat, he could force the remaining enemy units to reconsider their assault. James led his 12 men in a night attack that required perfect coordination and absolute courage. They had to cross 200 meters of open ground under enemy fire, assault a fortified position held by superior numbers, and do it all in complete darkness with minimal ammunition. Sarah found herself leaning forward, completely absorbed in the story. The attack began with James personally leading a reconnaissance of the enemy position. He crawled to within 50 meters of the North Vietnamese lines, spending nearly an hour studying their defensive layout and identifying key targets. Morrison's voice dropped to emphasize the stealth required for such an operation. James identified 3 critical elements in the enemy position: a command post where officers were coordinating the assault, a heavy machine gun position that was suppressing friendly forces, and a mortar team that was providing indirect fire support. James divided his 12 men into 3 4-man teams, each with a specific target. He would personally lead the assault on the command post, while his squad leaders took responsibility for the machine gun and mortar positions. The colonel paused, letting the complexity of the operation sink in. "Remember, Lieutenant, this was a coordinated night attack by inexperienced soldiers against veteran enemy forces. The margin for error was essentially 0. James synchronized the assault using hand signals and precise timing. At exactly 0430 hours, all 3 teams moved simultaneously against their targets. The attack had to be completed in less than 10 minutes to prevent enemy reinforcements from responding. Sarah could picture the desperate courage required for such an operation. James's team reached the command post first. Using grenades and small arms fire, they eliminated the enemy officers who were directing the overall assault. The psychological impact on the attacking forces was immediate and dramatic. Morrison's voice grew more animated as he described the action. The second team successfully eliminated the heavy machine gun position, but they took casualties in the process. 2 men were wounded, including the team leader. The third team encountered stronger resistance at the mortar position and called for immediate support. This is where James demonstrated the kind of leadership that creates legends. Instead of consolidating his limited gains, he personally moved to support the third team, exposing himself to enemy fire to provide covering fire for his wounded soldiers. The colonel stood again, using his hands to illustrate the tactical movements. James coordinated the withdrawal of his forces while maintaining pressure on the enemy positions. He personally carried one of the wounded men while directing covering fire from the remaining team members. But the counterattack had achieved its primary objective. The enemy forces, having lost their command structure and key weapons systems, began to fall back. The assault on Firebase Charlie faltered and eventually collapsed. Sarah shook her head in amazement. 12 men broke the attack of an entire battalion? Not just broke it, Lieutenant. James's counterattack was so unexpected and so aggressively executed that it convinced the enemy commanders they were facing a much larger force. The North Vietnamese forces withdrew completely, leaving Firebase Charlie in friendly hands. Morrison returned to his seat, his expression one of deep respect. James held that Firebase for 6 more hours until reinforcements arrived. By the time relief forces reached the position, they found evidence of a major enemy assault that had been repelled by what appeared to be a full company of defenders. When the after-action reports were filed, nobody could quite believe that 32 men, led by a 23-year-old lieutenant, had successfully defended against battalion-strength enemy forces. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the incredible story. What happened to Lieutenant McKinley after that? James was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that night. But, more importantly, he went on to become one of the most respected officers in the Army. James eventually made general, and he spent much of his later career developing new tactical doctrines for small unit operations. Colonel Morrison fixed Sarah with a meaningful look. James McKinley faced the same challenges you're facing, Lieutenant. People questioned his experience, his capabilities, his right to lead. But, when the moment came, when lives were on the line and the mission was in jeopardy, James proved that true leadership comes from within. Sarah felt the weight of all 4 stories settling on her shoulders. Sir, these stories are incredible, but I have to ask, how do you know so many details about all of these operations? Colonel Morrison smiled, but there was something different about his expression this time. That's a very perceptive question, Lieutenant. The truth is, I've made it my mission over the years to document these stories, to preserve the details of how extraordinary courage manifests under pressure. He paused, studying Sarah's face carefully. But there's another reason I know these stories so well. You see, there's a 5th legend I haven't told you about yet. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. A 5th legend, sir? Yes, Lieutenant. A story that takes place in Afghanistan in 2010. A story about a young officer who led a classified operation that saved the lives of an entire village and prevented a catastrophic intelligence breach. The pieces began falling into place in Sarah's mind, but she couldn't quite believe what the colonel seemed to be suggesting. This young officer, Morrison continued, was serving as a liaison between Special Operations Forces and local tribal leaders. She had developed relationships with village elders and had gained their trust through months of careful diplomacy. Sarah's heart began racing as she realized where this story was heading. When intelligence sources indicated that a high-value target was using the village as a base of operations, this young officer faced an impossible choice. She could call in an airstrike that would eliminate the target but likely kill innocent civilians, or she could attempt a ground operation that would put her own life at extreme risk. Morrison stood and walked around his desk, coming to stand directly in front of Sarah. This officer chose to infiltrate the village alone, using her relationships with the villagers to locate and neutralize the target without civilian casualties. Sir, Sarah began, but Morrison raised his hand to continue. The operation required this officer to move through hostile territory at night, evade enemy patrols, locate a specific target in a complex urban environment, and extract critical intelligence before eliminating the threat. The colonel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. What made this operation legendary wasn't just its technical complexity or the courage required to execute it. What made it legendary was that this young officer discovered the high-value target was planning to use chemical weapons against coalition forces and civilian populations. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to the colonel describe her own classified mission. The intelligence this officer gathered prevented the deaths of hundreds, possibly thousands of people. Her actions that night changed the course of the entire theater of operations. Morrison returned to his seat, his expression one of profound respect. Lieutenant Saracen, you are the fifth legend. Your actions in Afghanistan earned you the Distinguished Service Cross not because of politics or connections, but because you demonstrated the same extraordinary courage that defines every person who has ever worn that medal. The office fell completely silent as Sarah struggled to process what she had just heard. Colonel Morrison had known all along who she was and what she had done. Sir, how did you? I was the intelligence officer who briefed you for that mission, Lieutenant. I was the one who recommended you for the Distinguished Service Cross. I've been watching your career ever since, waiting for the right moment to have this conversation. Sarah felt a profound mixture of emotion washing over her. Relief, pride, gratitude, and something she couldn't quite identify. You see, Lieutenant, every person who wears that medal faces skepticism. It's the price we pay for belonging to an exclusive group. But the skepticism doesn't define us, our actions do. Morrison leaned forward, his voice earnest. Captain Vasquez proved that courage comes in unexpected forms. Sergeant Kim proved that brilliance under pressure can overcome impossible odds. Petty Officer Torres proved that tactical excellence transcends physical limitations. Lieutenant McKinley proved that leadership is about making impossible decisions under extreme pressure. And you, Lieutenant Chen, proved that moral courage is just as important as physical courage. You chose to risk your own life rather than allow innocent people to die. That's what makes you a legend. Sarah wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Sir, I've never thought of myself as a legend. I just did what needed to be done. That's exactly what makes you one, Lieutenant. Legends aren't people who seek glory, they're people who do what needs to be done regardless of the personal cost. Colonel Morrison stood and walked to a filing cabinet, retrieving a folder marked with Sarah's name. I want to show you something, Lieutenant. These are letters from the village elders you worked with in Afghanistan. They've been writing to me for 3 years, asking about the angel woman who saved their families. He handed Sarah several handwritten letters, translated into English. As she read them, Sarah felt a deep sense of connection to people she had met only briefly but whose lives she had permanently changed. Sir, I had no idea. That's because you never asked for recognition, Lieutenant. You completed your mission, filed your reports, and moved on to the next assignment. But the impact of what you did continues to this day. Morrison returned the letters to the folder. Those villagers tell their children about the American woman who risked everything to protect them. Your legend is growing in places you've never even thought about. Sarah felt a profound shift in how she viewed her own actions and their significance. Sir, why are you telling me all this now? Because you're about to face your greatest challenge yet, Lieutenant. Tomorrow, you're going to receive orders for a new assignment. You'll be leading a joint task force in Eastern Europe, working with Allied forces on counter-terrorism operations. The colonel's expression grew serious. This assignment will test every skill you've developed, every lesson you've learned. You'll be working with international partners who may question your experience, your authority, your right to be there. But now you know something that will sustain you through whatever challenges you face. You know that you're part of a tradition that includes some of the most courageous people who have ever worn this uniform. Morrison stood and extended his hand once more. Lieutenant Chen, you don't wear that medal because of politics or connections. You wear it because you've earned your place among legends. As Sarah shook the colonel's hand, she felt a transformation taking place within herself. The doubt and uncertainty that had plagued her for weeks were replaced by a quiet confidence rooted in the knowledge of what she had accomplished and what she was capable of accomplishing. Sir, thank you for sharing these stories with me. All of them. Remember them, Lieutenant. When the whispers start, when people question your place, when the impossible decisions come, remember that you're connected to something larger than yourself.
Colonel Morrison walked her to the door. Captain Vasquez, Sergeant Kim, Petty Officer Torres, Lieutenant McKinley, and, now Lieutenant Chen.
5 legends, 5 examples of what it means to earn the Distinguished Service Cross. As Sarah left the colonel's office for the second time, she noticed that the hallway still buzzed with the same conversations and carried the same energy as before. But everything felt different now. The weight of the medal on her chest no longer felt like a burden to be justified, it felt like a connection to a brotherhood and sisterhood of extraordinary people who had faced impossible challenges and found the courage to overcome them. Sarah walked down the corridor with her head held high, no longer concerned about the whispers or the stares. She knew who she was, what she had done, and what she was capable of doing. She was part of a tradition that transcended rank, gender, background, or the approval of others. The training facility awaited, along with new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself. But now Sarah understood that she had already proven herself in the ways that mattered most. The rest was just preparation for whatever legendary moment awaited her next. As she pushed through the doors of the training facility, Sarah caught her reflection in the glass. The woman looking back at her was no longer the uncertain lieutenant who had faced mockery and skepticism just weeks before. This was someone who knew her place in the world, someone who understood that legends aren't born from the approval of others but from the willingness to do what's right when everything is on the line. The Distinguished Service Cross caught the afternoon light, and Sarah smiled. She had 4 incredible stories to inspire her, and the knowledge that her own story was just beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead in Eastern Europe or beyond, she would face them with the confidence that comes from knowing you belong among legends. #Mockery met her badge. Document 3 6 months after her transformative conversations with Colonel Morrison, Lieutenant Sarah Chen found herself standing in a temporary command post outside Pristina, Kosovo. The international joint task force she now commanded consisted of American, British, German, and Romanian special operations personnel, all working together to dismantle a terrorist network that had been operating across multiple borders. The mission had started routinely enough. Intelligence sources had identified as cell-planning coordinated attacks on NATO installations throughout Eastern Europe. What began as a simple capture operation had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. Captain James Hartwell, her British liaison officer, approached the tactical display where Sarah was studying the latest intelligence reports.
"Ma'am, we've received updated information from our sources in Belgrade.
The situation has changed significantly."
Sarah looked up from the maps spread across the table.
Over the past months, she had earned the respect of her international team through competent leadership and tactical expertise, but she could still sense occasional undercurrents of skepticism about her age and experience.
"What's the new intelligence, Captain?"
Hartwell pointed to locations marked on the digital map display.
"The terrorist cell we've been tracking isn't just planning attacks on NATO installations.
They've acquired chemical weapons components and appear to be developing the capability for mass casualty events targeting civilian populations." Sarah felt the familiar weight of impossible decisions settling on her shoulders.
"How reliable is this intelligence?"
"Very reliable, ma'am.
Multiple sources, including signals intelligence and human intelligence assets. The German BND has confirmed movement of chemical precursors through their territory, and Romanian intelligence has identified key personnel involved in the operation."
Major Klaus Weber, her German counterpart, joined the conversation.
"Lieutenant Chen, we estimate the terrorists will have fully assembled chemical weapons capability within 72 hours. After that, they could execute attacks against multiple civilian targets simultaneously."
Sarah studied the tactical situation carefully.
The terrorist cell was operating from a compound in the mountains between Kosovo and Serbia, an area that presented significant operational challenges.
The terrain was difficult, the weather conditions were deteriorating, and the political sensitivities of operating near international borders added layers of complexity.
"What are our options for dealing with this threat?"
Captain Hartwell exchanged glances with Major Weber before responding. "Ma'am, conventional military options are limited. An airstrike would likely eliminate the chemical weapons threat, but the compound is located near a small village.
Civilian casualties would be inevitable." Major Weber nodded in agreement.
Ground assault with conventional forces would take too long to organize and could allow the terrorists to disperse with their chemical weapons. We estimate they have multiple escape routes and contingency plans.
Sarah felt the weight of hundreds, possibly thousands of lives hanging in the balance.
The situation reminded her of the stories Colonel Morrison had shared about impossible decisions made by legendary soldiers under extreme pressure.
What about a small unit infiltration? Lieutenant Colonel Andrei Popescu, the Romanian team leader, spoke up for the first time.
Ma'am, the compound is heavily defended, located in difficult terrain, and the weather forecast calls for severe storms over the next 48 hours.
A small unit operation would be extremely high risk. Sarah looked around the command post at the assembled officers.
These were experienced special operations professionals, each with years of combat experience. They were looking to her for a decision that could affect the lives of countless innocent people. Gentlemen, I need to study this situation more carefully. Give me 30 minutes to review all available intelligence, and then we'll reconvene to discuss our options. As the other officers dispersed to check on their respective units, Sarah found herself alone with the tactical displays and intelligence reports. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did at this moment. She thought about Captain Vasquez's decision to assault enemy positions single-handedly to save her wounded comrades. She remembered Sergeant Kim's choice to dismantle an entire defensive network while under sniper fire. She recalled Petty Officer Torres's tactical brilliance in turning a failed mission into a victory. Most importantly, she thought about her own classified mission in Afghanistan and the moral courage required to risk everything to protect innocent lives. Sarah began formulating a plan that would have seemed impossible to most people but made perfect sense given the tactical situation and the stakes involved. She would lead a 4-person infiltration team into the terrorist compound, neutralize the chemical weapons threat, and capture or eliminate the key personnel responsible for the operation. When the officers reconvened 30 minutes later, Sarah presented her plan with the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. Gentlemen, I've identified a solution that addresses all of our constraints while minimizing risk to civilian populations. I will personally lead a 4-person team in a direct infiltration of the terrorist compound. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Captain Hartwell spoke first, his voice carrying unmistakable concern.
Ma'am, with respect, that operation would be extremely dangerous. The risks are unacceptable for the commanding officer, Major Weber interrupted. Lieutenant Chen, your responsibility is to coordinate the overall operation, not to participate in direct action missions. Lieutenant Colonel Popescu nodded in agreement.
Ma'am, we have experienced operators who are better suited for this type of mission. Your tactical knowledge would be more valuable here in the command post. Sarah had expected this response, and she was prepared for it. Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern, but this decision is based on tactical requirements, not personal preference. She moved to the tactical display and began explaining her reasoning.
The terrorist compound is laid out in a configuration that requires intimate knowledge of chemical weapons disposal procedures.
I'm the only person on this team with the technical expertise to safely neutralize the chemical weapons components without triggering a catastrophic release. Captain Hartwell studied the intelligence reports more carefully.
Ma'am, couldn't we bring in additional technical specialists?
Not within our time constraints, Sarah replied.
We have less than 72 hours before the terrorists achieve full chemical weapons capability.
It would take longer than that to bring in additional specialists and brief them on the tactical situation.
Major Weber was reviewing the compound layout on the digital display. Lieutenant Chen, even if we accept the technical requirements, the infiltration itself presents enormous challenges.
The terrain is difficult, the weather conditions are dangerous, and the enemy forces are well prepared.
Sarah moved to a detailed topographical map of the target area.
Major Weber, you're absolutely correct about the challenges.
That's why this operation requires personnel with specific skills and experience.
She pointed to various features on the map as she explained her personnel selection. Captain Hartwell will provide communications and coordination with the command post. Major Weber will handle explosives and technical demolitions. Lieutenant Colonel Popescu will serve as our extraction coordinator and backup team leader.
Lieutenant Colonel Popescu looked skeptical. Ma'am, that's only 3 people plus yourself. Standard doctrine for this type of operation would call for at least 8 to 10 personnel. Standard doctrine assumes we're conducting a conventional assault, Sarah replied.
This operation will succeed through stealth, technical expertise, and precise execution rather than overwhelming force. She moved to a timeline chart displayed on another monitor.
We will infiltrate during the storm front that's approaching the area.
The weather conditions that make this operation dangerous will also provide concealment and mask our approach.
Major Weber was studying the technical requirements more carefully. Lieutenant Chen, you mentioned chemical weapons disposal expertise. What exactly are we dealing with at the target site?
Sarah pulled up classified intelligence reports on her secure tablet. Intelligence indicates the terrorists have acquired VX nerve agent precursors and are in the process of assembling complete weapons systems.
Improper handling during neutralization could create a chemical cloud that would affect the nearby village.
The gravity of the situation settled over the assembled officers.
Captain Hartwell spoke quietly. Ma'am, if those weapons are as dangerous as you're describing, shouldn't we consider evacuating the village before any operation begins?
Captain, evacuation would alert the terrorists to our presence and likely cause them to accelerate their operational timeline. We could lose the element of surprise and face a situation where chemical weapons are deployed against civilian targets before we can prevent it.
Sarah looked around the command post at each of her officers. Gentlemen, I know this operation carries significant risks.
But the alternative is accepting the probability that thousands of innocent people will die from chemical weapons attacks.
Lieutenant Colonel Popescu was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Ma'am, assuming we accept the operational plan, what's our timeline for execution?
We begin infiltration at 2,200 hours tonight. The storm front will provide maximum concealment, and intelligence indicates the terrorist forces will have reduced security patrols during severe weather.
Major Weber checked his equipment list. Lieutenant Chen, what about technical equipment for chemical weapons neutralization? Do we have the necessary protective gear and disposal materials? Sarah had already considered this requirement.
Major, we'll be carrying specialized neutralization agents that will render the chemical weapons harmless without creating toxic byproducts.
The equipment is compact enough for a 4-person team to carry without compromising our mobility. Captain Hartwell was studying the communication requirements for the operation. Ma'am, once we're inside the compound, how do we maintain contact with the command post?
The terrain and weather conditions will interfere with standard radio communications.
Captain, we'll be using a combination of burst transmission protocols and satellite communication systems.
If we lose contact with the command post, the operation will continue according to predetermined timelines and contingency plans.
The 4 officers spent the next several hours refining the operational details, reviewing contingency plans, and preparing equipment.
Despite their initial skepticism about Sarah's decision to personally lead the mission, they found themselves impressed by the thoroughness of her planning and the technical expertise she brought to the operation. As evening approached and the storm front moved into the area, Sarah found herself checking and rechecking her equipment one final time. The weight of the Distinguished Service Cross on her dress uniform, carefully stored in her personal locker, seemed to provide a connection to the legendary soldiers Colonel Morrison had told her about. At precisely 2,200 hours, the 4-person team began their infiltration of the terrorist compound. The weather conditions were exactly as forecast: driving rain, high winds, and near-zero visibility.
These same conditions that made the operation dangerous also provided perfect concealment for their approach. Sarah led the team through the mountainous terrain using night vision equipment and GPS navigation.
Her months of training and experience had prepared her for this type of operation, but she was acutely aware that theory and practice could be very different things. The compound appeared through the storm after 3 hours of careful movement. Intelligence reports had been accurate. The facility was well defended, with multiple security positions and sophisticated early warning systems. However, the severe weather had reduced the effectiveness of these systems and forced the security personnel into covered positions. Sarah positioned her team for a coordinated assault on the primary building where chemical weapons components were being assembled. The operation would require precise timing and flawless execution to prevent the terrorists from triggering a chemical release. Major Weber placed his explosive charges on the main electrical systems, cutting power to the compound and disabling security systems. Captain Hartwell established overwatch positions and began coordinating with the command post using burst transmission protocols. Lieutenant Colonel Popescu secured the perimeter and prepared extraction routes while Sarah moved toward the chemical weapons assembly area. The next 30 minutes represented some of the most intense and dangerous moments of Sarah's military career. She systematically neutralized chemical weapons components while enemy forces attempted to mount a defense of their facility. The terrorists, realizing their chemical weapons program was being destroyed, made a desperate attempt to trigger a chemical release that would create a toxic cloud affecting the nearby village. Sarah found herself in a situation that required split-second decisions with life-or-death consequences. Using her technical expertise and the tactical skills she had developed over years of training, Sarah disabled the chemical weapons delivery systems while coordinating her team's assault on the remaining terrorist positions. When the operation concluded 2 hours later, Sarah's team had successfully neutralized the entire chemical weapons program, captured 3 high-value targets, and eliminated the terrorist cell's capability to conduct mass casualty attacks. The extraction was completed without casualties, and the 4-person team returned to the command post as the storm began to clear. Intelligence analysis confirmed that they had prevented attacks that could have killed thousands of people across multiple countries. In the aftermath of the operation, Sarah received communications from NATO headquarters, various national intelligence agencies, and senior military commanders throughout Europe. The successful mission had prevented a catastrophic terrorist attack